Today is the fifth Sunday of the Easter season. We are rapidly moving on towards Pentecost, which comes not too long from now. As I have told you before, whenever I'm preaching, I always look for a theme running through the lessons, because you know our lectionary is designed, sometimes anyway, to the gospel and the Old Testament lesson, the epistle, all support each other. But I found it hard to find a common theme this week, as I do sometimes. I'll say more about that in a minute, but let me say a little word about these scriptures. As I have reminded you before, that I think the job of the preacher is sort of like a rabbi, a teacher primarily, to explain the scriptures and then not only explain the time that they were written in, but also to say why we should even bother to read them today, which is always a living issue for a lot of people. So let me start with the book of Acts, which was the longest reading today, but also very interesting. And actually, this experience of Peter was one of the earth-shattering experiences of anyone that we read about in the New Testament or the Gospels. And it was earth-shaking because it involved a radical change of mind for Peter. The chapter we read today from the 11th chapter of the book of Acts is just a summary, really, of the 10th chapter. You can go back and look at it. It's almost a repeat, except today's version was a slightly shorter edition of it, which is probably why the people that put the lectionary together use that for the gospel rather than the full story. But it's almost exactly the same. Peter, who was, of course, a very religious Jew, he lived by all of the Jewish laws, I suppose all the dietary and all of the times that said you had to do this and you had to do that. And he, I'm sure, considered himself almost blameless in terms of his religious faith. He was a practicing Jew, I'm sure very proud of it, and maybe a little bit too proud sometimes. We don't know, but he certainly was a believer. And Peter had this strange experience that you just read about, that he had this dream that this sheet came down from heaven with all different kinds of animals on it. Dreams, we all have crazy dreams, don't we, that seem to make no sense. I don't know if what in Peter's experience might have prepared him for this dream, but there it was, this big sheet in front of him with all kinds of animals. And then the words coming, kill and eat. Now this would have been a nightmare, actually, for Peter. Because as a good Jew, of course, there were certain things that he could not eat. He lived a kosher household. He observed all of the kosher laws as far as we know. But the meaning was clear to Peter. And I think it's clear to most of us that what this dream says, there is nothing that God has made that is unclean. And this would have been shocking to Peter, and I'm amazed that he immediately, or seemed to immediately, grasp the meaning of it in terms of his religious life. That God was reaching out through the person of Jesus, through the crucifixion and the resurrection. God was reaching out not just to the Jewish people, but to all people, to the Gentiles as they were known then and probably still are known today. So, if that had happened to me, I think I would have probably stewed about it for at least a couple of weeks, if not longer. But Peter no sooner had this dream than some people came knocking on his door and said, "We need you to come and see somebody," a Roman centurion by the name of Cornelius. Who, of course, was not a Jew. He was probably a practicing, we know he was God-fearing, which meant he was considerate of other people in as much as possible, and all that kind of thing. But Cornelius was certainly not a Jew. So here was Peter, and the law was very specific, said you can't have any dealings with Gentiles. Just they're out of the kingdom, they have no place. And here Peter's interpretation of this dream was there was no difference anymore. The God didn't give a hoot, as we would say, what kind of background a person was. So Peter seized onto this new message in an amazing, amazing way and followed these guys, and apparently took some of his Jewish friends for backup down to the house of Cornelius, where Cornelius, and we read, a group of people, presumably what the Jews called God-fearers or religious people, but not Jews, were waiting to hear what Peter had to say. And Peter explained the gospel to them about Jesus, who he was, what happened to him, and then suddenly the Spirit fell on all of them. And Peter said, well, who am I to say no to what the Spirit's telling me? In an amazing way. And so we read that Cornelius, and apparently a lot of the people that were with him, were converted. The Spirit fell on them. And then in the early church, sometimes the Spirit fell on people before they were baptized. In fact, quite often that happened. So after the Spirit, the same Spirit that fell on the disciples at Pentecost, not too long before that, that very same Spirit fell on all these Romans or whoever they were. And Peter said, well, if the Spirit has fallen on these people, we should baptize them. And so they were all baptized. So this is an amazing about face for Peter. And I often think that it would cause great psychological damage of some kind to just flip, like from one side of the coin to the other, just in a matter of a few hours or a few days, the time it got him from Joppa down to Cornelius' house. So really, I think there were two conversions in this story, were there not? The first was the conversion of Peter himself, from being a practicing Jew with no contact with anybody else, to Peter, the first of the Christian missionaries, if we can call them that, to the Gentiles. So both Peter and Cornelius had conversion experiences, and their lives went on from there as totally different people. So this is really an amazing story that oftentimes we don't think of the significance of it, that it involved these two conversions. Let me say a word about Revelation. Revelation is a very strange book, as we all know. And as we've talked about before, it was written probably about the turn of the century, that is around the year 95 or maybe 100 or in that general area, by a guy by the name of John, who was a totally different John than wrote either the Gospel of John or the Epistles of John. Whoever wrote this was probably living in some place like Ephesus, now Turkey, who was a former Gentile who had been converted, or maybe he was Jewish. He could have been easily been Jewish, but had another, like Peter, had a dream. And remember, in those days, in those cultures, dreams were quite often marked as a revelation from God. They were taken very seriously. They were not analyzed as we analyze dreams. They were not Freudians or Jungians. They just took a dream and said, what is God trying to say to me in this? And this dream that the author of the book of Revelation, also named John, had, was, by our standards, kind of like science fiction would be today, I guess. It was what we know as apocalyptic type literature, which even in those days, I don't think was made to be taken as a literal story. It was poetry. It was not really a novel. but it was a form of writing that was supposed to speak to people in a kind of a code. And the code in Revelation is fairly easy to decipher. Historians did it a long time ago, and I think that even in the day of John, people realized that John was not talking about the overthrow of Babylon as it's written in the book of Revelation. Babylon was just a symbol for him of the evil of the Roman Empire. And Rome was just beginning to persecute Christians. So John was writing to tell Christians, look, things have totally changed. Rome is doomed. God is working, and the end will come, and the end will be glorious. And this would have given Christians, particularly those Christians in persecuted areas, some hope. Even though it's a coded story and symbols that are, I just don't want to get into the minutia of what stands for what, but you can read a commentary and find out about it. But the thrust of it is that there's a new world coming. And as I think about that with you, don't we all long for a new world? We all of us in our busy, hectic lives, with all the issues that we face, in the dark of the night sometimes wake up and say, where is this new world? I need a new world in my life. And the answer to that, of course, is in the gospel. The new world for Christians, and perhaps for more than Christians, I would dare add. The new world is not only coming in a glorious way, but in the person of Jesus. It's already here. And this is what we mean when we're baptized into the community of faith. We believe, as we say in the Creed, of the world, of the life to come, the world everlasting, and the life to come. And that gives me great hope. It's the fulfillment of all of the Old Testament prophecies, this new heaven and this new earth. So that's certainly some of the good news. Even Revelation doesn't seem to have much good news sometimes. It's really a wonderful story about how God has acted. God will be in our lives in a new way, and that gives me great hope. You know, people in their own way have always wanted a new world, from Plato's Republic and all of the utopias of the world, the scenarios where there's a better society. You know, Karl Marx thought it was going to come through economic reform and it would be a new economic world. There's all different takes on what this new world is going to be like. And that leads us to the Gospel of John, because I'm really trying to tie these together. The Gospel of John that tells us that this new world is going to be based, and is based already, on Christians' love for one another. Now, we've talked many times about the Gospel of John, how different it is from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the difference certainly shows in the Gospel this morning, because John is the most personal of the Gospels. When he says in the Gospel today, he says to the group of disciples, he refers to them as little children. I'm going away to a place where you can't come. Pretty simple, straightforward language, but very personal language. And this, in the Gospel of John, this section is really Jesus' announcement of his passion and death and resurrection. Because in the Gospel of John, it's all referred to as the glorification of Jesus. And in this one term, glorification, it means death, suffering, death, and resurrection. And that's almost a kind of a code, I suppose. But we've known about that for a long time, that this coming world comes through Jesus' glorification. So he's telling the disciples that he's about to be crucified. And this takes place in the last part of the Gospel of John. You know, the Gospel of John probably is 60% stories about Jesus, but the last 40% is just the passion narrative, which we recently read on Good Friday. It's the story of the death and resurrection. 40% of the Gospel of John is this story. So this is when Jesus is telling the disciples, at the Last Supper, that's the context of this, what's going to happen. And of course, they don't have a clue, as any of us would not have a clue. But Jesus is telling them, and sure enough, what Jesus was saying, ultimately, they experienced and realized what he had been trying to tell them. But his final commandment in the gospel this morning is love one another. Now, love is, there's nothing Christian about love, is there? I mean, human beings have loved each other since, I suppose, human beings have been around. But John, we think, was writing specifically to the churches in Asia a lot of them were Greek-speaking. In fact, most of them were probably Greek-speaking. John was writing to churches that were not doing well, so to speak. The same as St. Paul, oftentimes, even in the Corinthians, we find concerns that Paul had about arguments in the church, about some people apparently thinking they were more Christian than other people, and all the kind of petty divisions that always plague not only Christians and churches, but everybody. And Jesus was concerned about that. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, the primary commandment I give you, forget about everything, the primary commandment is love one another. And so this is the culmination of the gospel, and this business of love one another. And we've talked before, have we not, about different kinds of love, but this kind of love that Jesus is telling people, love one another, is the Greek word, is the word that simply means to seek the good of the other person. We know, and we've talked before, that none of us emotionally sometimes can control love. It's kind of a free floating thing. We love some people, and some people we just don't like. But this has nothing to do with the kind of love that Jesus is telling the disciples, to love one another. He's telling them, look, you are all believers. You all have been baptized into the Spirit, just as Cornelius was. And I am asking you, as my follower, to put aside all these petty divisions and love one another by seeking each other's good. It's a simple thing to say, is it not? To seek somebody else's good, whether in fact you like them or not, whether you really want to have anything to do with them or not, simply as a fellow human being, to respect their dignity, as we say in our baptismal vows, to respect the dignity of every person and to love them in terms of seeking their good as well as your own. So I don't know if there's any theme to these readings this morning. There were two conversions in the book of Acts, Cornelius and Peter. The book of Revelation is a strange story, but is full of hope, because it talks about this new world which is coming, that we all are invited, and in fact we all are already part of it. And finally, Jesus tells us to love one another, which means to lay down our petty concerns and worries about one thing or another, and to simply seek others' good. And obviously, I don't like to get into political things in sermons, and I won't this morning, other than to say, unless Americans, all of us, can find some way of stopping this terrible polarization that's in our society, of red states versus blue, and Christians versus evangelicals as opposed to other kinds of Christians. These are all, I'm sure, an anathema in the sight of God. but they're all too real, as we all know. So my hope and my prayer this morning is that we listen to the words of Jesus, to love one another, and we ask ourselves, what can I do in my own life to break down these barriers all around me, sometimes in my family, sometimes in my close-knit group of friends, and certainly spreading out like ripples in a pond to the wider world. So these are the readings this morning. Please think about them as we move towards the great event of Pentecost. You all remain in my prayers as we all try to love one another and move further into the kind of world that God wants us to live in. Amen.